We're going to begin. Good morning to everybody. Sorry for the delay, but there have been some technical problems with Zoom. So we're going to start. Mr. Stefan Paillet from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is going to be here in any minute. And so we're going to start. And we'll settle our Zoom problems. So welcome to this mainstreaming event. This is in the Biodiversity Program Network. And so before we start, just two or three technical informations. This is going to be in two languages. We have speakers in French and English. They will speak throughout the morning. And you have an interpretation service via Zoom. For those who are English speakers in the room, please connect with Zoom on your computer and use your headsets. So
we have a live interpretation service on Zoom online. So feel free to connect either on the channel French or English to follow our speakers that will speak either in French or in English.
for that reason, we would ask all our speakers to speak distinctly and slow so that our two interpreters, Tim and Hélène, can interpret throughout the morning. The webinar format, well, it means that you can ask questions, can't take the floor, but there will be exchange sessions to roundtables during which you can ask questions via Zoom in writing and we'll answer. And so there are about 60 people are with us and remote and people in the auditoriums who will answer questions remote and from the audience in the room. This will be recorded for your information. And we will wind up with a buffet at 1 p.m. to start our conference officially. Well, I work for Expertise France, it's implementation agency for international projects. So I coordinate this project. The objective, the BIODEV2030, that's what I organize. This is going to be twofold purpose for this event. So we're going to share experiences and key lessons from this method, integrating biodiversity. And through this sharing experience, you will give keys to implement the keys decided on in Montreal in 2015. We're going to try to reach our objectives in this way. I'm going to move on to the next slide. We're going to have three stages this morning. First of all, introduction from the Foreign Affairs Ministry and the French Development Agency. We're welcoming Mr. Stéphane Baillet and Gilles Clates. And then we will have a phase about the key lessons for BioDev 230 mainstreaming method. That will be an hour to talk about the lessons, and we're going to share the lessons from feedback of 3 years of implementation in 16 countries. And then the second part will go into details about the results and the results of the projects in the 16 countries and in what ways have the countries been able to reach their objectives in terms of the objectives defined in terms of our project with two roundtables. The first one, as I said, will have a certain number of speakers from different countries. The focal point will be one focal point will be Ethiopia. Then we'll have the directors of the WWF from Gabon. I won't mention all these names now, but the point is that we depend on Visio issues because some of our speakers are remote. That is what I wanted to say to introduce this event. I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Stéphane Paillet. Mr. Stéphane Paillet, the Climate and Environment Director in the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs. Can you hear us, Mr. Mr. Paillet? Can you hear us, Mr. Stéphane Paillet? Are you with us, Mr. Stéphane Paillet, Deputy Director of Environment and Climate, French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs? Can you confirm that Mr. Paillet is with us as a panelist via Zoom? Yes, there we go. Now we can hear you, Mr. Paillet. I don't know if you see you, but I'm going to introduce this workshop. Yes, we can see you, Zoom, but your video isn't activated, apparently. I'm going to make my presentation. I don't know, see where I can activate the video. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about that, but I first of all like to thank you for organizing this event. It's an event that marks the end of the first stage of the BioDev project in terms of the objectives taken by countries in terms of biodiversity. We're going to talk about the results of the COP15 objectives. This is an important event. Uh, uh, so I simply wanted to indicate that the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs was very much involved with you in designing the BioDiv project, and that was in 2019 in terms of we can't hear you anymore, Mr. Paye. Can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you. Now we can hear you and see you. Everything's okay now? I just wanted to indicate that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Europe was very much involved in designing the BioDiv project in 2019 with respect to the pressure on biodiversity identified by EPAS. The ministry defined a priority, namely taking into account biodiversity in public policies and also emphasizing in its action the economic sector, which had the greatest impact on ecosystems without taking the systematic integration of biodiversity. Our efforts in terms of conservation and recovery of nature would have been fruitless. And aware of the pressure on preservation of biodiversity and economic development, we believe that it was indispensable to support partner countries in seeking for a balance between biodiversity and economic development. Thanks to the multi-actor approach, the BioDev approach developed a methodology. For us, it's unique and innovative. It included these two factors. This is phase one. At the end of phase one, BioDev project uh, allowed the countries involved to identify their progress, and this allowed us to define the ambitious objective set for ecosystems. This commitment of countries was reflected in negotiations about BioDev, which took place in Montreal last December. BioDev uh, created a coalition of countries favorable to these ambitious objectives in terms of biodiversity. We're talking about public policies, but also about private sector activities. And also, it's about the behavior of consumers. As for France and more globally, the European Union, this coalition went further than the original targets. So the targets then have led to changes which are necessary and policies in all economic sectors, reflecting the model proposed by BioDev. The ministry, of course, will renew its support, both political and also financial, to pursue the BioDev project in its second phase. And we are pleased with the pursuit of the project, of which we are now defining the scope and objectives in cooperation with the French uh, Agency for Development, and the WWF Phase 2 will lead to implementing the biodiversity program worldwide. This has come the idea was to reduce pressure on ecosystems and to limit the future costs of restoration in line with the worldwide framework for the program. And BioDev is going to help finance efforts to eliminate pressures on biodiversity. This second phase will focus on implementing the ambitious commitments made in the economic sector during phase one, and aims at favoring, including biodiversity in policies of the partner countries. This phase two of BioDev should attract new financiers, multilateral development banks in particular, and then in terms of COP 15, these partners should support countries more in reforming their policies to make these policies compatible with preserving biodiversity. So BioDev will make it possible to identify these projects and to catalyze these new sources of funding. To conclude, I wish you a fruitful workshop, and we hope to be able to draw lessons from phase one for the follow-up of the project and to guarantee effective work in the future in terms of biodiversity. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful morning. Thank you very much. And I hope you were able to hear me despite technical difficulties. Thank you. We did hear you. It was very clear about these prospects for phase two. Thank you for your presentation. Mr. Schicklitz, could you join us? Your executive director for sustainable development in the French Agency for Development. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you, Stéphane, for the introduction. It's a pleasure this morning to spend some time with the BioDev community of 2030, BioDev community, BioDev 2030. I think the extraordinary ambition expressed here, which was confirmed in December 2022, Mobile will mobilize national strategies for biodiversity in an approach concerning all governments of each partner, each country that signed this global agreement on biodiversity. This requires interministerial cooperation, prioritization, and also means to influence sectorial policies, which in sectors that exert pressure on biodiversity. This requires leadership of small teams in charge of national strategies for biodiversity in each country. And when we are aware of the resources of certain countries, in particular those countries that joined BioDev in 2030, of course, we can only express our dissatisfaction with the method and the results that emerged. In particular, I'm thinking, and what strikes me the most is the mobilization method. The interpreter cannot hear. The sound has been cut off. The interpreter apologizes. The interpreter apologizes to carry out on those bases sectorial action plans, which are the general philosophy of the national strategies. The point is to involve the key sectors of the economy to make them responsible, to diminish pressure on biodiversity, and also to bring in good practices like agroecology, sustainable forestry, restoration of land in each one of the key sectors. This is truly a really excellent piece of work in the framework of this project, and I think that it is up to us with the ministry to heartily thank Expertise France, the WWF, and all of the stakeholders with whom we worked and who have committed themselves very strongly in order to produce this diagnosis about the greatest pressures on biodiversity. And the point is also that we're going to work on one, two, three priority sectors to bring up plans which are concerted. So I wanted to emphasize the importance of these efforts, renewing these efforts. Once again, 10 million euros, that's the total amount. I would like to make some suggestions. I would like the link with experiences of the National French Strategy Team for Biodiversity. I would like this link to be created because once again, there it's not a question of North and South countries. There are especially teams mobilized at the national levels in order to speak to all the ministries, to all of the economic leaders and those from civil society of territories in order to implement this tremendous ambition that was adopted at the Kunming, protect 30% of these territories of these oceans. This is an ambition that requires great effort. The idea is to reduce by one half the use of pesticides. This must be done in cooperation with the agricultural world, of course. We have to restore 30% of damaged lands. This also requires local work with elected officials, with users in territories which request to work on site. And I believe that the experience in Cameroon, Madagascar, Guyana, the Fiji Islands, and France and have been fruitful. And so we'd like to share with these communities of action. In any case, as you know, we are trying to bring together at the worldwide level a community of national teams which implement the Kunming agreements. This is precisely BioDev 2030. That is what we're working on. I'd also like to mention the initial inspiration for the project. It came from another Expertise France project. It was called Post 2020. It also produced extraordinary results with exemplary activities. The idea was working on subjects like sectorial impact, mobilizing sciences, young people in regional workshops. So we have to bring together the efforts made in the framework of this project. And that's important. I wish you a successful day, a successful workshop. There are about 60 people online. That's wonderful. And once again, we have to work to implement national biodiversity strategies. We have to update them in terms of the Montreal ambitions. They have to be concretely adapted to the most important sectors, the most important for biodiversities, to reduce the impact of these sectors and to seek positive solutions in terms of biodiversity and nature positive, as we say now. This is crucial. And keep in mind also that the AFD, the French Development Agency, is actively working at the national level and international level to provide financing for biodiversity. This is a key issue. How can we make sure that every euro engaged by the development banks in the world, this is 15% of the world investment, how can we make sure this helps countries implement their national strategy for biodiversity? Congratulations once again to the entire team and the whole 2030 BioDev community for the crucial strategic work they have been doing. Thank you and have a fruitful morning. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I think we can launch the video in 3 minutes. It sums up the BioDev project over the past 3 years. Sorry, we don't have the sound from the video. Can you hear us in the technical room? The present biodiversity situation, it's called a sixth extinction. The world is moving toward catastrophe. If all these species disappear, human beings will disappear, mankind will disappear. BioDev, it's the project to facilitate commitment for biodiversity. We want to reverse the tendency to destroy natural resources. This is the BioDev 2030. The three pillars of the BioDev project, first of all, the scientific diagnosis, dialogue, and then commitments make it possible to reduce pressure on biodiversity. This is dialogue project structured around scientific findings. We work with the private sectors, and and we want to bring in the private sector into a sectorial dialogue to make commitments for biodiversity. For the first time, the government, civil society, and the private sector met around the same table to discuss the challenges about biodiversity and to define together actions making it possible to preserve biodiversity. BioDev did not just stick to these 4 points. It didn't try to replace the players. The players sat down around the table and made commitments. The, the point is to find out how our activity can help protect biodiversity. We are developing innovation. We see that the Earth has become less polluted. The soil has become restored. We see this now. We want this commitment to be specific and reachable for results in order that by 2030 we can measure the actions that the sectorial players have taken to reduce the threats. The commitments made have to be made concrete. Thank you. We can move on to the next slide. Two words to complete what was just said. And this is financed by the French Agency for Development. This is in 16 countries by IUCN. And these 16 countries, and we have Ghana, Tunisia, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Benin, Gabon, Cameroons, Congo, Congo Brazzaville, Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, Madagascar, Vietnam, and Fiji. We have tested in this project a method to integrate biodiversity in the most impacting sectors of the economy and the most important sectors of the economy for these 16 countries. And so this project, we have provided to the governments of these countries the means to identify the main threats weighing on biodiversity of those countries and to identify those 2 or 3 most impacting sectors of the economy. We want to engage a multi-actor dialogue for a multi-sector plan and a multi-partner plan. So today, at the end of the project, This is the end of the project. After 3 years of implementation, this is the end of the phase two will soon begin. This is the end of phase one. At the end of the project, our objective is to capitalize on the method and to share with others so that others can use this method. The objective is to draw key lessons from the method, and to do that, we have worked on capitalization. Will ask Antonio and Alice to join us to present this capitalization work on two aspects. The first one, scientific analysis, and the second, the multi-sector dialogue. Thank you very much. I have 5 minutes not to present you the entire publication, which was based on the results of the first phase of the project, as our friend reminded us. There are three ingredients in BioDev 2030: scientific diagnosis, the diagnosis of the sectors which have been identified, and the multi-player dialogue and dissemination of experience. The publication is a sort of summary of the experiments and lessons drawn from the practice of scientific diagnosis. The main threats in these 16 countries. All these countries used an approach based on three messages: a review of existing literature, second, innovative use of new measurements created by the Lucas University. This is sort of a thermometer to measure risks for a species on the level of a country or region of a country. This measure has been used in different ways and was also combined with interviews of national experts in biodiversity, experts from the economic sector, and in particular priority sectors. This was done 16 countries in these 16 times in these countries. We tried to draw the main methodological lessons. We have a publication about the resources that are overexploited. You can download it and you can maybe put it on the screen. There's a code here. You can see the code. With your smartphone, you can find the right page on which you can download this publication. Next slide then. The idea is to share lessons, the methodological lessons that we want them to be used by other countries. They can draw inspiration from. They can consolidate the foundations of this whole edifice. They can use the BioDev method. We have this scientific basis. We can be sure that we have identified the pressures, the strongest pressures on biodiversity in the broadest sense, on ecosystems, on species. And so we also formulate recommendations in terms of methodology to follow. The idea is to prioritize threats and to reference economic factors with the partners working on this project. So for whom is this document? For banks, NGOs, governments, public development banks. Even if this is a secondary public audience, we try to reach people working in the economic sector. What it is to be used for, to provide inspiration, to identify and solidly classify the main threats based on science. So this is a scientific diagnosis which mobilizes, well, which brings together and combines different sources of data. Of course, the world database on biodiversity, the red list of ecosystems, the red list of threatened species, the star metric, and How can we consolidate all this knowledge? We're going to ask experts about this, national experts who possess the knowledge, who can complete the lessons that we can draw from these first two methods. Each method has its own advantages and drawbacks. The evaluation of threats is done globally. The STAR metric may not cover all of this, so we have to identify zones where the strongest pressures are on species on the basis of expert knowledge, experts who have specific knowledge or specific knowledge of sectors and regions within a country. Next slide, please. So we see here the strengths and limits of each method. How can we find synergies and make sure that they are complementary? I just mentioned that the knowledge of experts at the national level completes a review of the literature of the subject, which does not always contain specific elements about a country. The STAR method is global, even if we can adapt it to a given country.
On apprend donc beaucoup de choses sur cette métrique STAR. Il y a des encadrés très synthétiques qui rappellent l'essentiel de cette métrique. Et puis, on regarde aussi si chacune des méthodes a convergé. Enfin, est-ce qu'elles ont convergé ou divergé? La plupart du temps, elles convergent, c'est heureux, mais parfois non, et c'est source d'enseignement. Voilà. Et puis, la publication à la fin se termine par 2 pages, très ramassées, très synthétiques, où on rassemble là, des étapes à suivre pour conduire un diagnostic scientifique similaire dans d'autres pays par les acteurs que j'ai évoqués, avec donc les étapes à suivre, des recommandations d'outils à utiliser et de manières de faire, notamment est-ce qu'il faut fournir à l'avance aux experts nationaux les résultats des 2 méthodes précédentes ou est-ce qu'on les laisse un peu à l'aveugle pour voir si ça converge ou pas. Donc, une sorte d'indépendance de l'expertise nationale par rapport à une approche qui peut être faite de plus loin. Et puis, on encourage aussi à saisir tout le potentiel de cette métrique STAR. Donc, on peut calculer des scores nationaux, on peut spatialiser les scores, on peut faire des cartes. Donc, on peut regarder quelles sont les zones dans lesquelles, en intervenant, en réduisant les menaces ou en restaurant des écosystèmes, on va avoir le plus d'effet sur la baisse du risque d'extinction d'espèces. Et puis, on vient compléter ça avec tout le savoir des experts, portant notamment sur la distribution spatiale des secteurs et des activités économiques et des écosystèmes et de leur capacité à fournir des services écosystémiques aux populations. Donc voilà, c'est la publication que je vous encourage à regarder et à diffuser, se termine par ces 2 pages super opérationnelles. Voilà, il y a quelques étapes, des recommandations et des outils mobilisables. La diapo suivante, c'était des exemples de recommandations, mais je vais pas rentrer du tout dans le détail. Voilà, c'est un échantillon des 12 recommandations que l'on formule grâce à cette expérience-là du diagnostic scientifique des menaces. Voilà, donc n'hésitez pas à surexploiter cette ressource inépuisable qui est cette publication. Merci, Alice.
Okay. Merci, Antonin. Esra? Désolée, on peut passer sur la slide. Bon, Antonin vous a présenté le premier pilier de la méthode BioDev, qui est l'approche scientifique. Moi, je vais vous parler du deuxième pilier, qui est le dialogue multi-acteurs. Esra, sorry. Donc là, vous voyez une représentation un peu schématique de la méthode BioDev. Donc, chaque engrenage représente un peu une étape clé. Et ce que vous voyez là qui traverse tous ces engrenages, ce petit trait jaune, c'est vraiment ce qui est au cœur de la méthode, c'est les plateformes de dialogue multi-acteurs. Et ces plateformes, c'est là où on va parler d'intégration de la biodiversité, c'est là où on va réunir des acteurs qui viennent d'horizons différents. Donc, on va avoir des acteurs publics à l'échelon national, local, on va avoir des acteurs privés et les organisations de la société civile. Donc, c'est là où on va réunir vraiment tous les acteurs qui sont intéressés par les questions de biodiversité, mais aussi par les questions de développement économique. Et c'est un résultat aussi majeur dans les pays que la mise en place de ces plateformes. Et donc là, je vais partager un peu quelques leçons tirées de l'expérience des 16 pays sur comment mobiliser les acteurs pour qu'ils intègrent ces plateformes, et notamment les acteurs du privé, parce que c'est eux qu'on veut mobiliser pour l'intégration de la biodiversité. et comment catalyser des engagements volontaires de leur part. Ce qu'on entend par plateforme multi-acteurs, c'est vraiment l'ensemble des réunions bilatérales, des ateliers de dialogue, enfin l'ensemble des échanges qui vont avoir lieu dans le cadre du projet BioDev entre les parties prenantes et avec les parties prenantes. Esra. Un premier enseignement, c'est le portage de cette plateforme, en fait, pour lui donner aussi de la légitimité à la démarche. Donc, au cœur de BioDev2030, il y a le rôle du point focal CDB, mais je laisserai Monsieur Mélessé en parler un peu plus. Mais comme on l'évoquait avant, il faut aussi sortir un peu de ce portage que par le ministère de l'Environnement. Et un enseignement, c'est aussi d'assurer l'appui d'autres ministères, des ministères sectoriels, des secteurs prioritaires, mais aussi du ministère de l'économie, du ministère des finances. Donc, ça peut être en les intégrant aux instances de gouvernance, mais aussi en les faisant intervenir lors des échanges pour qu'ils puissent partager aussi leur vision politique de l'intégration de la biodiversité. Et donc, ça va permettre de donner du poids à cette démarche, mais aussi de favoriser la participation d'acteurs sectoriels, puisque c'est des puissances invitantes sur lesquelles on peut se reposer. Un deuxième point, c'est que ces plateformes, comme je le disais, elles vont permettre vraiment d'inviter largement. On dépasse un peu cette approche par silo. On va faire en sorte, via ces plateformes, que les questions d'intégration de la biodiversité, que les questions de biodiversité ne restent pas que entre les experts de biodiversité. Et du coup, on va essayer d'inclure des acteurs privés qui sont quand même relativement éloignés parfois des enjeux de biodiversité. Et donc, un enseignement, ça a été vraiment de prendre le temps de les accompagner dans la compréhension des enjeux, que ce soit par des formations, que ce soit par des réunions pour les accompagner dans la compréhension des enjeux de biodiversité et des changements de pratiques. Mais aussi, ces plateformes, donc, comme elles réunissent des acteurs d'horizons assez divers qui ne parlent pas forcément le même langage. Et donc, l'interconnaissance de ces acteurs entre eux, de prendre le temps qu'ils se connaissent, qu'ils comprennent les intérêts de chacun, les motivations, les contraintes de tous, ça permet aussi d'engager un dialogue avec les acteurs qui se base aussi sur des relations de confiance. Et par exemple, au Bénin, ce qu'ils avaient fait, c'est au début des ateliers, que chacun se présente, que chacun présente aussi son rapport à la biodiversité. Et ça permet, c'est un temps qui permet vraiment de créer du lien entre les acteurs. Voilà. Et puis, bien évidemment, faut amener les gens à voir ces plateformes de dialogue comme un espace d'opportunité où ils vont co-construire leur engagement, qu'ils vont co-construire les engagements qu'ils vont prendre. Un troisième, du coup, un troisième apport de ces plateformes, c'est donc il faut encourager l'engagement des acteurs privés pour faire aboutir des engagements volontaires. C'était un peu l'objectif de BioDev. Et donc là, ce qu'on s'est rendu compte, c'est que il faut aussi s'adapter aux contraintes des acteurs du privé et puis nourrir les discussions de leur réalité. Donc, ça passe par faut aller sur le terrain, aller rencontrer les acteurs, voir quelles sont leurs pratiques, échanger avec eux. C'est par ça qu'on va faire émerger aussi des solutions communes. C'est aussi en montrant des exemples d'acteurs qui se sont déjà engagés dans l'intégration de la biodiversité. Donc, ces champions qui vont intervenir et montrer en fait que c'est possible le changement de pratique. Et donc voilà, nourrir en fait les discussions des réalités du terrain. Donc ça se fait aussi par les diagnostics scientifiques. Et puis aussi engager les institutions financières. On va avoir l'exemple du Tunisie qui va en parler, où ils ont vraiment réussi à faire intervenir et à faire prendre des engagements de la part du secteur financier. Mais voilà, engager les institutions financières dans ce dialogue multi-acteurs pour qu'ils puissent présenter leur stratégie de financement et pour aussi déjà les familiariser aux enjeux de biodiversité et les préparer aussi au financement des engagements ou des pistes d'engagement qui seraient prises. La dernière slide, Esra. Donc, pour compléter aussi le travail qu'avait fait Antonin, donc on a fait tout un travail de capitalisation sur la méthode BIODEV 2030. Là, c'était quelques exemples, un peu de quelques leçons sur le dialogue multi-acteurs et sur la façon de mobiliser les acteurs pour qu'ils prennent des engagements. Mais je vous invite aussi à regarder là sur le QR code et à télécharger les guides qui sont aussi derrière vous. Voilà, qui vous donne un peu étape par étape les clés de succès qu'on a et nos recommandations sur comment mettre en œuvre cette méthode et la répliquer dans d'autres pays. Voilà.
Je me permets, merci beaucoup Alice. J'ai oublié de mentionner une chose qui me semble importante, c'est que la publication IUCN que j'évoquais est maintenant existe en 2 langues. Donc elle a été initialement rédigée en anglais et elle a été traduite. Donc il y a plein de pays francophones qui ne sont pas... Non, parmi eux, certains nous disaient, bon, c'est dommage que ce soit qu'en anglais. Bah, ça y est, maintenant, on a la traduction en français. C'est important parce que ça peut se diffuser dans la francophonie.
So we found it online. If you didn't have time to download, here it is. And it's customized. Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonin, and thank you, Alice, for all this. We are going to have a roundtable now, and of course, we had some problems with the video a few minutes ago. We hope that everything is sorted now. And now for this roundtable, Mr. Melese is the CDB national focal point of Ethiopia, and is also a negotiator and president of the group of African negotiators for COP15, Mrs. Moon Said, director of the banking group of Finance Council of Tunisia, and she was part of a multi-stakeholders dialogue. Nathalie Niaré, director of VVF Gabon, and she will give her testimony as a director of VVF. She will talk about her experience, and also she was in charge of BIODEV project in Gabon, and also Luther Anukur, who is the regional director of IUCN SRO, Eastern and Southern Africa. So, Mr.
Can you hear me? Can you speak? Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Melese. We can see you, and I think we can hear you as well.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Mr. Melese, as I just said, you are the national focal point, CBD national focal points for Ethiopia, and you were the president of the group of African negotiators. You have been fully involved in the implementation of BIODEV2030 in Ethiopia. So, first of all, can you explain us the role you played in the implementation of BIODEV in Ethiopia, and the role as a national focal point in this project implementation?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you for giving this opportunity. We are also, Ethiopia is thankful for the French Development Agency and IUCN for supporting in this project. As to my role, I played an important role in preparing the meeting and facilitating the stakeholders dialogue together with the BIODEV project officer. I was also politically lifting the project. Not only that, I myself, as an expert in the area biodiversity, so I was also supporting the consultant and other researchers and suggesting and commenting the issues of the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute, and directly also involved in these dialogue processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Melese. So we were talking about the two pillars of the BIODEV project, the scientific assessments of threats to biodiversity and the multi-stakeholders dialogue. According to you and to the Ethiopian experience of BioDev, what are the main advantages of this assessment of threats to biodiversity, and how can you describe how it was useful for you as a national focal point? The assessment conducted in Ethiopia.
Thank you very much. So the IUCN star metric method is the new method for us, really. It was introduced and injected into our scientific analysis on the biodiversity. This is something great for us, which we used on, we will be using for the biodiversity analysis. Still, it has a very important advantage for the star matrix, especially for bigger animals. But it has less to do with for smaller plants and lower animals. However, we have filled the gap just by means of literature review, expert interview, and in-depth dialogue. The benefit of this project really for us is that there was a multi-stakeholder discussion of the local communities, NGOs, economic sectors, government bodies, researchers, academia, civil society, all they involved in the process of dialogue. So what we found from our discussion is that it drives or deepen understanding of the real threat of Ethiopian biodiversity. For your surprising, this is the first time for us where broadly the study was made at the national level on the biodiversity threat. So it's the first time. So nationally, we were beneficiary of this, and we had no such comprehensive biodiversity threat study. And then this is helpful for us as a benchmark for scientific study on biodiversity, and at the same time, many of the findings stood as a benchmark for us while we are continuing our post-2020 biodiversity issues and the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And then because of this deep understanding, many of the actors or the stakeholders, they have been looking for a solution for biodiversity because they have deeply understood the threat. What are the threats, the actual threats they understood. And they have been looking for the biodiversity solutions. And then this has motivated many of the stakeholders to act voluntarily. And then this promoted voluntary commitment from our side. And not only this, the advantage that we gain is that we have grasped the knowledge of indigenous people what knowledge they do have, and what are the problems at the grassroots level, so that once we understand the problem of the local the community, for instance, from Ethiopian side, the problems of pastoralists and agro-pastoralists, because they are moving along with their livestock from the lowland to the higher, especially where we conducted our research in the Valley National Park. They move from the lowland area to as far as the park, looking for the water and the grasses. This is not always, but when there is a drought in the area, so they leave the area and look for the grasses and the water. So then this also shows we have to establish certain permanent solutions, for instance, water source and cultivating the grass and others. So it enables us also to look for problems of the local or the indigenous people. Once we create or we look for a solution for them, we are also designing a solution for biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melisse, for this testimony. So, as I understand, you one of the main assets of this method and this assessment is to bring together knowledges from different stakeholders, from different local communities, NGOs, private sector, and the fact that the study which combine star metric with an expert interview and the literature review is completed with all these knowledges from different stakeholders.
Yes.
So thank you very much for your feedback. We know that national focal points have been very involved in the BioDev implementation in Ethiopia, but also in all the 16 countries of BioDev, and it was really helpful to hear you today, to have this testimony. Thank you, Mr. Melisse.
Thank you very much.
So you can stay with us until the end of the roundtable. So if we have some question at the end, you might be able to answer.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to give the floor to Mrs. Moon Said, who must have joined us now, and she's the General Delegate of the Banking and Finance Council of Tunisia. So, as the representative of our banking sector, banking and finance sector, you were associated to the discussions in Tunisia, and you were one of the stakeholders, key stakeholders of these discussions initiated by WWF Tunisia. And can you hear us? Mrs. Said, can you hear us? Hello, I can hear us. Yes, we can hear you very well too. I was connected, but not as a panelist, but thank you very much to give me this opportunity to take part to this event for BioDev 2030. And we thought I hope we'll have other projects. Just to recall, it's not Moon, it's Muna. So it's a professional association, the General Delegate of the Banking and Finance Council of Tunisia. So offshore banks, universal banks, leasing companies. And we signed on the 20th of June 2019 with the network of United Nations, the Convention of Cooperation. And the objective of the convention is really to engage, to promote responsibility of companies and societies, and to implement the 17 ODD banking and finance sector. And this is a structured approach for us. Because we really want to follow what the United Nations says, and we are dedicated to human rights, environment, and the fight against corruption. And since last December, we started to communicate, and we published our report, over 96,000 reports on Global Compact, and it's over 21 speakers over 60 countries. And the main objective is to promote the legitimacy, social and environmental legitimacy, biodiversity, climate. It's really something that worries us, and we're conscious that consequences can be very severe. All the climate changes that we are experiencing now, and we need an emergency world intervention so as to stop the fact that biodiversity is, disappearing, and we need to find an answer to the climate crisis as well. The first step, we signed the charter, voluntary engagement of the Banking and Finance Council and all their members as well, with WWF for the protection of biodiversity. And this was exactly on the 29th of November 2022. And with this charter, we are coherent with our vision and mission so that our sector will progress, respecting the international standards, and especially the governmental social norms. And we want to watch all the risk that could impact investments, and with our member institutions, we really want to be careful. We have two domains of actions. So integrating the criteria for the environment in favor of biodiversity when we make decisions and assessments for banking and finance, promoting good practices with our members, and also good support for investment that will protect biodiversity, restoration of ecosystems, and climate resilience. Of course, development in favor of green development and eco-responsible development, and we also encourage financing activities that will integrate in their advancing and their value chain the biodiversity value. And we want to add value to this. And of course, communication on the progress that's been made, and we will do this periodically. We will review the progress that have been made. And of course, the issues as part of the convention that was signed with the Minister of Environment and Agriculture and Fisheries and WWF, they will support us and to give us technical and scientific support that is appropriate, so that we know how to manage biodiversity better, to have support missions on the level of the banking sector, and also the pilot project, because we want to have expertise and experience with biodiversity. But we also and we will also have a rich database with lots of information that will cover the whole national territory, and also the risk areas, because they need to be upgraded all the time, and to facilitate dialogue and participation with the ministries that I've mentioned already, and all the stakeholders, Ministry of Finances, insurance companies, central bank, for the implementation of the plans and programs of biodiversity in Tunisia. So we're very conscious of the degradation of biodiversity, and this is why we answered positively to the request of WWF, so as to start a dialogue with financial institutions that are members of our Banking and Finance Council. 2 roundtables have already been organized. One, biodiversity and finance. How do we react? It was in 2022, and it was, the Banking and Finance Council. The Minister of Environment was present as well. And regarding BIODEV project, we spoke about 2 roundtables, and our objective was to pursue the dialogue with key stakeholders, understand the reasons of the loss of biodiversity, and raise the awareness of banks on the role that they can play when they're engaged with preservation and restoration of biodiversity, and pursue dialogue with the key stakeholders of the project on the issues and opportunities of mainstreaming of biodiversity. And we want to share good practices and knowledge as well. And also to really think about good practices, good experiences, and also we want to develop tools in mainstreaming and the role of the banking sector to preserve biodiversity in Tunisia. So we have lots of meetings. We invite people who are in charge of BIODEV to organize other meetings with biodiversity and finance, in consultation with our Banking and Finance Council and the ministries involved. Also, we want to have workshops so as to develop a national plan, workshops where we can think about all these issues until 2030. Banca, because it's important to finance projects as well and to measure the impact on the preservation of biodiversity. I'm very sorry to intervene, but we only have 1 minute left. So 2 other points, because as of course, Convention on Biological Diversity, we want, of course, our members to really to help each other, because we want as well to have a campaign for reforestry, because a lot of forests were destroyed. So we want reforestation of the forests that are destroyed, and the fight against the loss of biodiversity. And also the last point, to carry out a study, and the objective is to establish a mapping of the banking mechanisms that would help to develop and preserve everything that is to do with biodiversity and ecosystems. That is it.
Thanks for telling us how you're involved in BioDev in this roundtable with people from banking finance. And so now we can move on, and we mentioned the Charter of Bund Practices, in which you commit yourself to pursue the dialogue and with the banking and financing sector in Tunisia. Thank you for your presentation. Now I'm going to give the floor to Nathalie Agnare. Nathalie, are you with us? Nathalie Agnare, are you with us? Good morning. Yes, good morning, Nathalie. Thank you very much for coming in along with us. You're directress of the program in Gabon. You have a twofold role. You were in charge of a BioDev project in Gabon, in charge of implementing the project in Gabon. Could you present to us the actions of WWF in Gabon and how the BioDev project is part of the WWF activities in Gabon? Thanks you very much. The WWF has been established in Gabon since 1991, so it is a little bit more than 30 years. As of today, we have 2 major programs in the field in Gabon, one in the north of Gabon, that is in the border zone with the Congo Republic and Cameroon. So we have another program that's in the south of the country. We have 4 offices in the field. The main one is in Libreville, and the 3 other offices are directly involved in field programs. As for the pillars of our program, WWF in our country has developed a strategy for 2020-25. It's based on 4 pillars. The 4 pillars of the strategy of WWF are related to sustainable development of biodiversity, on climate elements, including resilience, also green program with respect to natural capital and the governance question with the involvement of youth, and also with respect to civil society and gender issues. So we have these 4 pillars of our strategy. We see other spaces that these pillars, in particular, the management of biodiversity and governance, especially those 2 pillars, are part of the work that we are conducting in Gabon in the framework of BioDev 2030. So this project then is part of the implementation of our strategy, and it made it possible to deal with points which are important for us. For a long time, WWF focused mainly on forests, conservation. Now we are really opening up new themes, in particular with respect to agro-industry in mind. So the BioDev project enabled us to connect with those sectors with which we hadn't previously worked very much. For us, the BioDev project, wasn't just in addition to the WWF program. It is an essential component of WWF national strategy in Gabon. Thank you very much, Nathalie. As I said earlier, you're in charge of the BioDev project in your country. You were able to experience the project with its difficulties in implementation. Could you talk about the main assets of the BioDev approach in terms of biodiversity? And can you talk about the difficulties you encountered to make a diagnosis and also to bring along the different stakeholders to commit themselves? The BioDev project enabled us to have around the table players who previously hadn't spoken to another one sufficiently. True. When we launched the BioDev project, generally speaking, we talk about the loss of biodiversity. Generally, the stakeholders on the national level, well, thought of forest exploitation of forests. For other sectors like the mines, agro-industry, they were identified in Gabon. For these other sectors, this was something really very new in terms of the administration, but also in terms of the private sector. People had a rather compartmentalized vision of biodiversity loss. And people believed, for example, that mining activities had no impact on biodiversity. When we wanted to talk with some players, they they said, go to the ministry in charge of forestry, because that's where it's all about. The point was to bring everybody together and to explain what biodiversity protection was all about and see how activities of different parties could have an impact on biodiversity. So it was rather difficult at the beginning. It was hard to bring these players together on the same table. But toward the end of the project, we felt a real enthusiasm in these different sectors. We felt they were beginning to understand the problems and that they are beginning to identify what they can do, what they can change, so that we tried to improve good practices used. For us, that was really the big challenge, to bring these players together. They are in agro-industry, conservation, in mines, bringing them to the same table. That was a challenge, bringing them to talk together, talk about national problems, and to present the commitments and orientations that are possible. So this was really the main asset of this project, namely, well, it was the point was really to raise awareness, because this is something that initially wasn't very easy to do, because for different parties, they were compartmentalized. They focused on forests, and as for the mines, it was about production operations. So the projects have to be implemented and announced by the government. That's what people answered. So what the point is not to stop people from conducting their economic activities. This is what we had to show. We had to show that it was possible to carry out activities, but in a better way. As for the difficulties, as I said, in particular, there's a question of the mobilization of some players. They took in a certain amount of time before understanding the utility of the project because it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to convince them that their impact was real, that their activity had a real impact in the field, because generally they didn't perceive these impacts. They only saw their activities. So this required working very much together, and it required explaining to them, and especially, as I said, to show that the BioDev project is not a way to say that you have to stop mining or to stop agro-industrial activities. The point was to show them that things can be done differently. So with respect to these difficulties, as I said, we had to work quite a bit with the national players. We had to take a lot of time. It, it required effort. So we had to have specific meetings with players to make sure that they understood the issues. And also we had to support these players because it's not enough to say what the problems are. It's not enough to say what problems the activities create. The point is to provide support, to bring people to make commitments. The point is to make sure that the conservation policy, the sustainable protection policy, the point was to make sure that these policies are properly carried out. This wasn't easy. It required a lot of time. It took a lot of time, even when we had to have regulations that had to be validated. Sometimes our pressure was that when reports are presented, the different parties try to defend themselves. They defended their own interests. But we stress that the point wasn't to accuse anybody, but the point is to present the situation and to look at all the available data and to present the general situation in Gabon. That is the present situation. The other interesting thing here, we talked about the STAR method. We use that. There was the question of perspectives, prospects. Maybe their activities did not have much impact today, but when we see projections announced in the program, we can see that a given sector can have a greater and greater impact as time goes on. So the point is that we shouldn't wait for these impacts to take place. We can already take measures. We are ready to help you so that when your activity will be developed, we want measures to have been taken so that the impacts be reduced. So for us, this is an everyday type of work with a certain number of stakeholders. We worked quite a bit with a focal point of the CBDB, which truly helped this process at the national level. Also, a certain number of entities became involved because the CDB focal point helped us. So the administrative part was facilitated, and it helped involve the different stakeholders. Thank you very much, Natalie, for this interesting testimonial. It shows that awareness, raising awareness, convincing players that they're threats to biodiversity. This is a process that takes time. And our BioDEV approach is to use science to convince the players of their role in biodiversity. This process takes time, and it requires multi-player dialogue. And in every country, it takes time. You talked about the role of the focal point, which brings together all the stakeholders around the same table, and which makes it possible to convince the different players of their relationship with biodiversity. Thanks very much, Nathalie. I'm going to give the floor now to Luther Anukur, who's a
director for IUCN of IUCN SRO, so IUCN for Eastern and Southern Africa. And you have also been involved in the BioDev project implementation in the 3 countries of Eastern and Southern Africa, coordinated and implemented by IUCN, so Mozambique, Kenya, and Ethiopia. Luther, can you hear us?
Thank you so much. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Luther. So, Luther, can you explain us, first of all, the role you played in the implementation of BioDev in Kenya, Mozambique, and Ethiopia? And the same question as Nathalie. According to you, what are the main advantages of this BioDev method to convince the private sector and the different stakeholders of their impact and dependency on biodiversity? And can you give us some few examples of good practices that you have noticed in either Mozambique, Kenya, or Ethiopia?
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be a part of this roundtable to share the experience of implementing BioDev in Eastern and Southern Africa. And very specifically, I would say that as a region, we've been supporting the development of BioDev in Kenya, Mozambique, and Ethiopia, as has been mentioned. Our roles that we have really played were, one, anchoring the project into the 3 countries, Kenya, Mozambique, and Ethiopia, and that meant hiring the project staff and as well as launching the project to enable buy-in from key stakeholders. We also were able to establish strategic partnerships and collaboration arrangements, especially from the CBD focal points, like Mr. Melese had just said. The other role that we had to play was organizing and overseeing the 2 key assessments. This was the National Biodiversity Threat Assessments, which was identifying the key economic drivers for erosion of biodiversity. But also the other second study was identifying options and scenarios of voluntary commitments for biodiversity in 11 key economic sectors. So we supported that process. And the other one was organizing the multi-stakeholder dialogues. I think a lot has already been mentioned by my colleagues about the multi-stakeholder dialogues. We organized 8 national and 10 subnational ones at sectoral ones at landscape level. And these were extremely useful for establishing ownership for biodiversity mainstreaming, but also to get best practice to include in voluntary commitments for each of the value chains. And I'm happy to say that with this, we're also able to, in the same dialogues, we're able to mobilize voluntary commitments for biodiversity from the public, private sector, and civil society. And so far, 9 voluntary commitments have been proposed through these multi-stakeholder dialogues. The other role that we had to play was learning and showcasing the BioDev methodology at regional and global stage. And here we were able to do this at the first Africa Protected Area Congress, the World Conservation Congress for IUCN, the CBD COP, and where we were able to get representatives from the public and private sector who witnessed the effectiveness of the BioDev approach. The other role that we actually also played was supporting national processes, especially in preparation for various convention meetings that were happening last year, such as the CBD and also the a review of other various protocols. This was both in Kenya and in Mozambique. And I would say that these processes were extremely useful, first of all, in helping review the previous decisions which had been made, but also to guide and position the countries in terms of negotiating for getting proper positions for negotiations during the COPs. And this was really very welcome support by BioDev. I would want to say that the BioDev approach certainly has had very many positive, has added lots of value in terms of what's going on in the countries. The first one is bridging the knowledge among stakeholders, and especially because of the evidence from the studies that we have mentioned, the different actors were able to have informed decisions in terms of evidence, but also, we've been able to influence national processes. For example, in Kenya, we've been able to support in collaboration with the Kenya Bureau of Statistics and the UN Statistics Division, we've been able to support a process of benchmarking accounts for ecosystem extent and selected ecosystem services using national data. Now, these assessments will actually contribute to the Kenya National Plan for Natural Capital Accounting. Again, Kenya, we've been able to initiate with the CBD focal point a process to establish the National Biodiversity Coordination Committee, which will bring together biodiversity actors across sectors to enhance collaboration, which actually is extremely important. And I could go on with many examples, but maybe the very last one on this one is in Mozambique, in collaboration with the Federation of Trade Associations. We've been able to engage private sector in establishing voluntary commitments and other actions of especially integrating biodiversity and climate change into business.
Thank you very much, Luther. And we will have a testimony of the Federation of Trade Association in Mozambique later. So this is a good introduction. And thank you for your this testimony. And I just noted that you talk about the same thing, the fact that the BIODEV method can allow to gather different knowledges from the different stakeholders, and this is a key point, and it is very interesting and insightful to hear what IUCN SRO, how IUCN SRO supported the different country offices during the project. So thank you for your testimony. On passe à
We'll move on to a question and answer session for our speakers. Don't hesitate to send in your questions directly to the chat box, directly for the people remote or the people here in the auditorium. Don't hesitate to tell us if you have questions for any of our speakers. Thank you very much. There's a question about the STAR method. Felix, I'm MTE, that's my name. You talked about the STAR measurement. I didn't understand how it worked. Could you explain a little bit how it works? Thanks very much. The STAR measurement system, I learned about it over the past 2 years. It's a score. It reflects the risk of extinction of species for a given spatial unit. You know how the IUCN red list works for threatened species. There are 4 categories: vulnerable, and then not threatened. Among the threatened or vulnerable ones are endangered, critical danger, and I've forgotten one. No, we have a score for that. Then we see the status of species in the zones that we're working on. We might find a score, and so in a given zone, there are a lot of species threatened, the higher the score is. And the more the area has an area with all the species which are proportionally important with respect to their general habitat in the planet, the higher the score will be. What is the formula now? Let me think a second. Yes. There's the intensity of the threats in the given zone. The higher this intensity is, the higher the score is. So the score depends on the intensity too. This measurement brings together information about the threatened species, the threats, and the importance of the zone being studied by comparison with the habitat area of the species considered. So we bring together all these elements, species, the zone, we bring together information for the red list, and so we construct a measurement. So we exhaustively describe the different elements, amphibian animals, mammals, and birds. So we describe these elements exhaustively. And some plants are also taken into considerations. So that is the how it works. It is easy to decompose, to break down this and we can make maps, especially to identify those zones where threat reduction programs have helped lower the risk of extinction. So it is a decision-making aid. We can evaluate threats and see how recovery works. And this way we can have the star score reduced. This allows us to prioritize spatially action zones for extinction of species. This isn't all that has to be said about diversity. Biodiversity is not only about threatened species, it's about ecosystems that can help us. And there's also the issue of replaceability. And it's not only about usefulness for people, but there are things that have to be preserved for other reasons, for moral reasons. There's one specific thing. This system works very well. Research, it feeds this regularly. April 2021 in Nature, there's a publication, and there's the IBAC tool, which makes it possible to operationalize STAR. And all this is accessible online. Don't hesitate to ask any other questions you might have. Thanks, Antona. Any other questions from the audience or the chat box? If there are no other questions, yeah, we have a question here. Thank you, Caroline Piquet, French Development Agency, Climate and Nature. Thanks very much for presentations. We have had very concrete cases, testimonials from the field in some countries. We want to move forward, capitalize on experience. Of course, we have to look into constraints and difficulties. I'd like to know what is the cooperation going on between players who hadn't spoken together previously, and on the other hand, what are the obstacles, constraints, difficulties are there obstacles in subsectors? We talked about mines. We know that not everything is easy to move forward. What are the difficulties encountered? What are the constraints in different sectors that might be obstacles? And what are the contrasted situations of these 16 countries? Maybe the situation is different in each country. What are the levers and constraints that we have to take into account? Thank you. Just to clarify the capitalization presented to you, our position was that this was a guide for good practices, and it was based also on difficulties encountered and what has to be done, what was possible to be done, and the capitalization work with dialogue, diagnosis, scientific bases, and the last one was a sectorial dialogue and diagnosis of sector activities. All this takes into account difficulties, and there are many difficulties in the 16 countries. There are different types of difficulty. The obstacles are different from one country to another. It's not necessarily linked to a sector. It is sometimes implementation is more complicated in one country than another. I don't know if it's a good idea to go into detail. Antona, Florence, maybe you want to talk about this. We can get back to that if you want. the interpreter cannot hear the speaker. The interpreter apologizes. The interpreter cannot hear the speaker. The answer is not all that easy. We're going to provide partial answers as we go on. Our colleague from WWF might help us. If there are other questions, maybe you can wait till then. Thanks, Florence. Any other questions? If there are no other questions, let's have a quick break. It's 11:43. Let's resume at 11:50. For the people of Visio, 7-minute break, and we'll see you at 11:50. See you then.
So we're going to start again because we don't want to be too late. Because we're already 5-10 minutes late. We'll try to catch up, but I would like us to start again with the second part of this conference. So we looked at the methodology and the key learnings during those 3 years of implementation in the 16 countries. And the idea of this second part is to have a look, to have a more thorough look at the results of the project and how what the results for the 16 countries. We are talking about voluntary engagement action plan, voluntary action plan. So I'm going to now give the floor to my colleagues, Emmanuel and Esther and Florence, to join me around the table, and we're going to look at the results, and then we'll have a roundtable, and we'll look at the implementations of the sectorial and also the Global Biodiversity Framework. So thank you to you, Emmanuel, and now you have the floor. So you're the Monitoring Evaluation Learning Coordinator for Expertise France, the Sustainable Development, and you're going to talk to us about the evaluation study on the effects of the project, the results of the project during the last months. Thank you. Yes, I've got 5 minutes to present to you some key figures of the projects. So to start, we had with this project 220 meetings, workshops, formal workshops that were carried out. So 14 events per country. And this is really, so I mean, what we discuss. So it's really the tip of the iceberg, because of course there's all the bilateral points and maybe less formal meetings and parallel meetings. And with this project, so you saw 400 in the video, 600 or 650, and now it's 672 organizations that were involved in the project. A third from the public sector, 1/3 from the private sector, 20% from civil society, and 14% from other actors. So it's 42 organizations average per country. Next slide. And as Quentin was saying, we carried out stakeholder satisfaction at the end of a project, and this was done through a questionnaire, online questionnaire, and we received 400 responses from 13 countries. And the first objective of this was to see the satisfaction of the key holders regarding BioDev that we presented this morning. And the figures coming out of this investigation is that 92% of the respondents declared that they are satisfied with a voluntary approach to developing commitments. 31% very satisfied, 95% satisfied with a multi-stakeholder approach as implemented by BIODEV 2030, and 96% satisfied with the science-based approach to build the voluntary engagements. Second part of the assessment was more dedicated to the private sector. So we wanted to know if they felt more supported. 93% of respondents from private sector declared they felt better capacitated. 52% said yes, very capacitated to pursue biodiversity mainstreaming in their economic sectors. And 89% of the private sector respondents believe that their presence in the platforms on biodiversity issues was useful in taking the dialogue forward. And still, the section that is specific to the private sector, to the question, do you believe that the project helped improve the mobilization of private sector? 71% of the respondents of all the sectors answered yes. Sorry, that was a question open to all the stakeholders, and 71% of respondents believe that project helped improve the mobilization of private sector on biodiversity issues in their country. So then a part of the questionnaire wanted to know if the project managed to better some level of knowledge. So state of biodiversity, 1, 2, impact on production practices, 3, production practices in favor of biodiversity, 4, role of public policies in preserving biodiversity, 5, dependence on economic sectors and populations on good state of biodiversity. And there, 46% of respondents declare that they have improved their knowledge on the 5 issues above. So it's really the global figure on the 5 issues mentioned above. And then the last question, that is quite interesting, because we were asking them on the perception, on the scope of commitments. So we were asking them to have commitments that are as ambitious as possible. Is it best to work on the national level on one sector only, or only if is it better to develop engagements on several sectors in a specific territory? And we saw that 75% of respondents agree that the territorial approach is the one that fits best to have ambitious developments, ambitious engagements. And that's interesting for the next phase. So I'm sorry, lots of figures all at once, but the report is being translated at the moment. So it's already in French and it's available on the website, and we are having it translated into English soon. So soon it will be available in English on our site as well. So don't hesitate to read them so as to get more information of those very global figures. Now I'm going to give the floor to Florence. Florence Curet, you're in charge of project officer with IUCN, and you'll go back on this notion of voluntary sectorial engagement. And this is and talk to us about on what the countries that are supported by IUCN during 3 years, what are the results, and what the study that was ordered recently. And so we're going to get, yes, thank you, Quentin. I think that what I'm going to present to you you will have the whole vision with what Esther said. We will explain the very good result, I would say, that we got on the questionnaires that Rema has just presented, so as to really give you the background, and because we're talking a lot about voluntary commitment, and our definition with BioDev it's from. With this project, we wanted to identify and initiate changes transforming in favor of biodiversity per sector. And for this, even if with private sector had to be mobilized, we had to, one way or another, bring actors to think the policies. So what's good for the rules in what's good for biodiversity or not for biodiversity in the rules and regulations, and engage the private stakeholders to mobilize by voluntary approaches, good practices. And I mean, private sectors, but also civil society. And civil society was not excluded at all on the other way around, because we wanted all the actors of civil society, all the actors of the public sector. So we have a definition of voluntary commitment according to BioDev. That's what we wanted. What would be a good commitment, a good transformative commitment, as you can see it on the screen. So first of all, we thought, okay, it needs to be materialized by an agreement. So at least it needs to be a moral agreement, written and made public as well. We thought that this agreement had to have stakeholders, but ideally several stakeholders, so sectorial or multi-sectorial. We thought it would be pertinent as well on the territory or on the country, because some countries are more centralized than others, some are decentralized, so we need to adapt to those cases. And we wanted as well that these commitments, voluntary commitments, are going to give concrete results, because it's one thing to have a plan, but to make it concrete, that's where it's sometimes, so objectives, indicators, what's what we wanted as well, and with practical changes to adopt good practices by the private sector and to adopt conditions that will facilitate the state or territorial collectivities. All this must be anchored in the scientific approach, and we were and also assessment that will support all this, accompany all this, what was very, very ambitious. So now, if we go to the next slide, we have a reality check. So, no, go back, please. Thank you. So, sometimes, as we were going along, maybe we thought, we had very, very big ambitions, and maybe our ambitions were a little bit too big as time was passing by. We didn't have time to do the follow-up and assessment of the commitments, but very often, and the other point is that so as to engage, to commit the public and for decision makings and change public policies that can be slower than the capacity for decision making. So it was not always possible to imagine that we had only one document where public and private would commit together. Of course, the quality of exchanges that were there were not reconsidered, but we had to accept that some decisions couldn't give results straight away as part of a project. And this is why that explains partly this slide. It's the results. So this graph is presenting to you a synthesis. So we have an external assessor with WWF to organize all these voluntary commitments that we obtained in the countries. So Altai Consulting did that for us. So 3 groups. So green, it's the dark green. It's the level of voluntary commitment as so the partners discussed, negotiated, approved, and they approved an action plan. So dark green is it's about some countries or domains. Light green, it's countries where there's avenues of voluntary commitments, but it's not all finalized. The signature, the decision is not finalized. And orange, for different reasons, some things were put aside, or when there was diagnosis, it took more time than we thought. So at scenarios that are issues from diagnosis, and they were done by the consultants, but there was not much debate around those scenarios that were talked about. So you can see that we have a lot of dark green or light green. So it's so we're satisfied with this. Next slide, and you can see so it's done per sector. So it's IUCN or WWF. Agriculture was a common subject for all the organizations, because we know that it's a very, very big challenge everywhere, followed by extractive industries. So I want to say it's also mining industry. So mining industry as well. And because it's a topic in a lot of countries, forestry and fisheries, and also other cases that are more specific. And also I go to IUCN results and observations on the countries with the next slide. So before that, we want to say hello to the pandas of WWF, because beyond the results, the facts and the figures, we think, and that's what Altai said to us as well, because they could observe this through the interviews of the stakeholders that they interviewed for the study. They confirmed to us that what is key in this project is to be able to, we have actors from the private sector, the public sector, all around the round table. So it's not only the destination, it's the company, it's all the people who are around the table, to have the right people, and to have the good to have the good stakeholders, because if there is if the chair is empty, we don't go forward. So we need the relevant people as well, and that's why the multi-stakeholders platforms are very, very good. That's why we defend this so much. And the results from IUCN, so I'm not going to go into details, but you can see. So you have the transparency, you have the workshops that were organized per country, per domain, sector, or sometimes intersectorial, so a variety of appropriation of this method, and it's quite large, with results that are some, so the dark greens, that's the successes, light green, some things that moved forward, good discussions were had, and also I added it. So it's not a voluntary commitment, but I added the number of workshops done with the financial sector. They were very, very interested. As the project was advancing, they wanted to learn, and they were very often part of the workshops. The national restitution workshops were very often part of this. So IUCN, we are very, very surprised to see one of the results. One of the results, and Emma shared it with us. So very territorial approach when we solicit the communities, but the social, economic, the more present, the more local, so as to exchange. It's really creating brilliant moments where things happened, and in Senegal specifically. And if they're online, we can thank them, actually. We worked with a consultant team supported by LEAF, and with a methodology from CIRAD, with very, very interesting games and plays, so as to try and seeing Senegalese partners who were with facilitators who are Senegalese, so that we would all think together the solutions that they need, the solutions that we need to think about, the impact of the solutions, so as to allow them to visualize how it would happen for them. And we were able to get to commitments, multi-sectorial commitments with 14 partners of fisheries and agriculture. So it's a method of to mobilization. So it's really good results, because we know that the stakeholders they keep being committed. They really appropriate what was told to them. And Fiji here. Fiji, maybe for reasons that are cultural reasons, the community work is so that people understand the stakes, because why it's important, why for Pacific Islands to farm kava is very, very important for them, because there is an emerge, because historically kava was a traditional drink, and now it's an energy drink, and the whole world is interested in energy drinks. So there is an economic boom, but of course there are very, very big risks of native deforestation of native forests. So once we give the means to the people to understand and to appropriate and to think of the solutions for them, they were able to give very concrete lists that were adopted by the traditional chiefs. So it's a result that is very satisfying for us. Next slide. And what we can see here that's very interesting too, of course, we're talking about commitments on the territorial level, but it's always going around. What I mean is that then it goes national and sometimes regional. And in both cases, in Senegal, the stakeholders of the region committed to take some actions. I couldn't show you all this, but they also identified requests that they want to make to the state, so that the rules are going to change, so as to have long-term impacts. And that's very, very important, because it means we're going around. It's it's a loop, and it's a virtuous loop. And in Fiji, we spoke about commitments with the culture of kava and the territories that are the more concerned with the farming of kavas. But it's for all the regional, it's for all the Pacific Islands, so as to have a sustainable sector for Cava, for all these those islands. And that's why we're not talking about territory, national, we need to work on both all the time. Last slide before we conclude. So here we can see, what's being confirmed is that some sectors have some sectors in commons. Ethiopia worked alone on coffee, but all the other sectors, cotton, soja, rice, several countries discussed this, the ins and out. So we can feel there would be something that we didn't do enough, we didn't share enough, but we can share good practices, and we need to work more on this because we didn't have time to share always good practices. Next slide. And so our conclusions and solutions for the future. So in the violet square, if we want to accelerate the implementation of the global framework with BioDev and phase 2 BioDev, so we need to work to a community of practices. I mean, it's very ambitious, but to share experiences on the sectors and the practices, there will be an opportunity. And also the question of champions was talked about several times. We realized, and that's true, that it's a question that we identified champions on the national level in some sectors, but there are some sectors, and the mining sector was talked about, and we realized on the national level is not the right stage. We need to mobilize internationally because they make the decisions. And nationally, the decision-making is not there, it's on the international level. So this needs to be better for us to go further. And that's really the case. Everything that is industrial, huge, when there is a huge capital potential, this needs to be discussed globally. The other thing, we now have multi-stakeholders platforms that are working very well. They're appreciated by the partners. They're good platforms to work on the national strategies. So it's something that we really need to take advantage of, and also some actions that need to be implemented is to go further in action plans, in smart action plans, very concrete, transformated, that, you have action plans and we get to a concrete project. And we have a lot of elements now with, so my conclusion with Little Panda, so that you all wake up, that's okay. We still have a long way to go, but when we see what we've managed to do, and with BioDev, we've gone so far already with BioDev, we have good reasons to be happy and to remain optimists. Esther, I hope you agree with me. Esther Bessy, you're project officer with WWF France, and you're going to present to us the implementation and the results of BioDev 2030 of the countries that were supported by WWF France in this project. Yes, okay, this mic is working. Okay, hello everybody. Yes, we're going to go to the presentation of the results of a project in the countries that were supported, coordinated by WWF France. So on the screen, you can see a table there that is similar to the one that Florence presented. And that this is really what's being said earlier. In our case, we have 4 countries and the result is voluntary commitments that were negotiated and validated by the stakeholders that took part to the dialogue. So in Madagascar, for example, in the agriculture sector and fisheries, Uganda, agriculture and and wood, energy wood, Tunisia, agriculture, agro-industry, because it's mineral water industries that we worked with, and mining sector, and Vietnam, aquaculture and forestry sector. For the other countries, you can see that the approach was, we don't have results. Yes, it doesn't mean we don't have interesting results, but no final results. And Natalie was talking about this before, and she said that there are some results that are worth mentioning, and the fact that a lot of stakeholders who are not talking to each other before, the result that we got is that they were all around the round table, speaking together, exchanging, and this is really important for us, even if we don't have voluntary commitments as such, as we hoped to do initially. So this project, what we learned from this project. So 30 more seconds on this slide, please. So what this project showed us is that for a good negotiation phase, you need, I would say, at minimum 6 months. And that is only under this condition that you can guarantee a good appropriation of the states by the stakeholders, and then they feel legitimized to have voluntary commitments. Now, maybe some key lessons and differences from the initial voluntary commitments framework, as Florence presented them. So first of all, on 2 aspects. So with whom in this project? Initially, the project was mainly and exclusively private sectors, actors. That's what we saw in most of the countries. Nevertheless, because we did implement dialogue platforms with civil society and public sector and private sector, so they all got quite excited, and that some of the actors wanted to commit. Then I'm thinking about the public sector, and we see this as a condition that will facilitate. Nevertheless, it's true that in some countries, I'm thinking about Uganda, there are some public stakeholders who signed commitments as part of this project. Then there is the question of the scale. At what scale those commitments were taken. So we saw the same loops as in the case of IUCN. As part of the dialogue, we have workshops that are carried out nationally, locally, and as part of the realization of the studies, we have missions on the ground that were carried out in several countries, in Madagascar, for example, in Uganda, and in Vietnam. And that being said, regarding most of the commitments that were taken, in most countries, it was taken nationally, even if in the commitments were identify already some prioritized area with the view of implementation. So you've got a map here, a map of Tunisia, mapping of Tunisia. You can't really read it well, but if you read the reports that are available on BIODEV 2030, then you've got this. It's more clear on this report, and it identifies several areas. So it's for the mineral water sector. So it's the biodiversity and water capture, so as to put water in water bottles, and that and so we have priority sites on which we're going to work. Thank you. So at the moment, we have an assessment study on the results of the project and what came out as the voluntary commitments in all the countries. And so compiling all the voluntary commitments and also in the 16 countries. So we identify some tendencies on the themes that the stakeholders wanted to work. So here on the screen, you have the 4 sectors that are the most represented in the 16 countries: agriculture, mining, forestry, and fisheries. And what we can observe, first of all, is that there is a great importance is given to the restoration actions and reforestation. So it's it's a trend that we can see. And in the 4 sectors here, we have also an important traceability is a challenge, certification traceability. We saw that in all the countries. And something that came out, and we didn't expect this at the beginning, but it came out in some countries, the structuring of structuring some sectors that are a little bit that are a bit disseminated, and there's not always an organization there. And one that is surprising, but it's a question that we had that you asked in this room about mining. Sometimes the first commitment is to apply the rules that is already in place, to apply the rules that are already existing rules. And we saw that in all the countries that wished to work on the mining sector. And this is a first step before you commit, any further. Next slide.
Here you see some examples of the commitment that we obtained with respect to pressures identified in Vietnam, for example, in forestry and wood. We have the overexploitation of forest resources and encroachment on natural forests for monocultures. There was a commitment by companies to non-encroachment and non-conversion of natural forests. And also there's development of certifications. In Madagascar, there's a shrimp fishing, and here we have a challenge with respect to the impact of non-selective fishing gear, which has an impact on breeding and nursery areas. And here we have a commitment by small fishermen to use only regulated fishing gear by 2030. This is 50% of small-scale fishermen. And there's another example, that's Guyana. This is a formally signed commitment, and there are figures here that are worth mentioning. We see the massive and systematic use of chemical fertilizers in agriculture, especially in fishery. So in the framework of a dialogue, we obtained a commitment, 50% of producers promised to use only biofertilizers and 100% after 10 years. We have to take note that these are signed commitments, but they were subjected to financing necessities in order to be carried out. This is the present situation at the end of the project. And here's the last slide. The important thing here in the framework of the project is that we're not talking only about a project based on a dialogue with sectors identified. It's also about an inclusive, broad process to guarantee application of biodiversity principles in all sectors. We worked a lot on negotiations to adapt a world framework for biodiversity. That was Montreal in 2015. And I mentioned Gabon and Madagascar. Those are the examples on this slide, but we find this in all the countries in which we worked. In Tunisia, we made a special effort to create a group of journalists they started at the end of 2021 to work on the issue, and they continued in 2022. These journalists dealt actively with biodiversity, and now these journalists are able to talk about biodiversity in the media. This is an important point for broader understanding of biodiversity. And last item, I won't dwell on this too long. Well, also, we worked with other sectors, even if they weren't all selected. In particular, in Guyana, we organized 2 training sessions for fishing communities. Let me conclude now. Florence raised this item, so here we see the fact that there was orientation provided, the way was provided. This is relevant and interesting. So the stakeholders have to follow it. They have to use the method in the framework of the project. The different players have to put into practice locally. This is a big factor in success in those countries where the approach was applied. Thanks very much, Esther, and thanks to all 3 of you for your testimonials. You talked about the implementation by stakeholders. João Carlos Freire,
Confederation, sorry, of Business Association of Mozambique, and can you hear us, João Carlos? Donc l'idée de cette séquence,
the idea of this sequence is to illustrate through testimony from the private sector, just to illustrate how voluntary commitments are perceived and what are the challenges involved. For the future, we decided to focus on Mozambique. João Carlos is going to make a presentation if he hears us, and then we'll give the floor to Emily Petre, who's head of AFD. It is the head of the AFD in Mozambique, the French Development Agency operations in Mozambique.
Hello.
Hello. We can see you, we can hear you. So I give you the floor. So João Carlos, you represent today the Confederation of Business Association of Mozambique. In view of this initial ambition that Florence just highlighted, the fact that countries were supposed to have voluntary commitments signed at the end of the project, what are the concrete results of your project, of BIODEV project in Mozambique? And can you tell us a bit about the difficulties you encountered, and maybe the strength of the method that you identified to make a private sector commit for biodiversity?
Yes, good afternoon to everyone. My name is João Carlos Frade, as you said. First of all, I'm representing the association, the Confederation of Business Association in Mozambique, that leads the dialogue between the public and the private sector in Mozambique. Through the IUCN, we invited the private sector to commit themselves through the corporate actions in favor of nature. And our main objective is to promote the improvement of the business environment through the implementation of measures that contribute to the preservation, and also to mobilize finance investments on this regard. You asked me about the main challenge that we got, but before, maybe I will say how we start doing this. We start firstly disseminating the concept of the voluntary commitment, that it is not known by the private sector in general, and together with the IUCN, we promote few seminars to the specific sectors, the ones already related, agriculture, forestry, mining, and fishing. And also we start to evaluate the, the technical assistance that the private sector especially needs to put in place the voluntary commitments. On this regard, we identify few challenges that I would like to highlight. It. First of all, is the mobilization of the large corporations and also the SME suppliers to adhere to voluntary commitments. The idea is to anchor the SMEs to the large corporations in order they go beyond what is established by the legislation. We do have legislation for this in Mozambique. However, the legislation is not followed by the most of the companies in this regard. Also, we felt that there is no clear certification system on an international base that can guiding us about the voluntary commitment. I may resume it in one question. Exactly what is this the voluntary commitment in terms of certification, if you want to certificate it. At the same time, we identify that for the future, after the BioDev project finish, we may need to train SMEs on consultancy base to certify the companies who want to keep their voluntary commitments certification. And at the same time, by hand, the finance sector also must be engaged on it. And we think that the voluntary commitment might be the one privilege criteria to provide finance to the companies who want to borrow money to the banks. Basically, this is the what we did during this time, and I don't know if I answer in full your question.
Yeah, it was very clear. Thank you very much, João Carlos, for your testimony as a private sector and involved in the BioDev multi-stakeholders dialogue. So, juste avant la table ronde,
round table, Véronique, Nicolas, can you come up here to the stage? Before giving the floor, I'd like to give the floor to Emily Petré. Emily, you're director of the French Development Agency in Mozambique. You might react to João Carlos's testimonial. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your point of view as a head of the AFD agency. What about the approach used in Mozambique? In your opinion, what are the main advantages of this method to reach commitments from the private sector with respect to biodiversity? You have the floor. Thanks very much. I hope that everybody can hear me. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to represent agency, the French Development Agency, in this BioDev experiment. First of all, for my agency, the biodiversity is a historical issue, and we give priority to the sector. We have a big portfolio of projects in the field. For over 20 years, we've been working on biodiversity, but so far, our projects have been field projects with NGOs. We work a lot with the International Conservation Agency. So these have been local projects mainly. It's often in partnership with other organizations. What BioDev has provided was a new approach to the sector. Already, we had a project with the private sector neighbor, the Global project, which works on a loss of biodiversity. But in addition to that project, we don't have many projects involving private-public dialogue. So I think that the whole utility of the agency is to move forward with this project to set up and strengthen the dialogue with the authorities. And we want to work on national strategies right now. We have trouble doing this. And then as for the method, I won't go back to the platform multi-actor part because this has been already discussed. And the mainly result of the project was to bring different players around the same table so they could get to know one another very clearly. This was the most obvious result, but this wasn't the first experiment of this type in Mozambique, but it was the most complete one. And then, as for the methodology, namely diagnosis, dialogue, and commitment, I won't dwell on that, but simply I'd like to say that I believe that one of the main results was learning about methodology, learning about tools. I would like to nuance this. Mozambique is the only Portuguese-speaking country involved, but we were able to work with partners in English, and we worked with the public sector and even with very small economic players. We need tools in Portuguese because that is really necessary. So there's this process of training, and I believe that we've done some interesting things there in Mozambique. As for difficulties, my feeling is that with respect to Mozambique, the public-private cooperation worked very well. And in addition, aside for initial expectations, we had local cooperation with producers in Mozambique at a very local, decentralized level in the zones of production. And sectors like sugarcane, fishing, and soybeans. So in the private sector, I think this worked very well. However, my impression is that mobilization of public players was less strong than what we had imagined. And maybe it's a matter of ministries. The ministries are too compartmentalized. They're set up as pyramids, and they're set up with too few resources. And so I think the ministries are approached by different players from the outside. That puts pressure on the ministry. So maybe this is what we have to work on for the next stage of the project. Of course, we have to pursue all this work with the private sector. We're working on pilot projects. There are high expectations with respect to these projects. We're talking about mechanisms of loss of biodiversity. It's the same logic. We're talking about setting up a framework and carrying out these pilot projects. It's difficult to go beyond these commitments, which is necessary sometimes. And we have to deal with industrial sector here. And we see that we sometimes have trouble implementing these projects. So, of course, there are high expectations here. We have to prove that these projects are relevant. Also, there are high expectations with respect to the political side of the project. Namely, we have to work with the authorities and ensure their contribution in the framework of a national strategy. This really has to be integrated into a national strategy, and this has to be improved. This really requires support in terms of leadership and methodology and so on. I believe that this is a real difficulty, the major difficulty. And this is linked to another point that I'd like to mention. It's a political lever. We have in France locally, have worked with embassies that have been mobilized in identifying issues. I believe that during the second phase, we should work more together. There's this international framework which is important. And likewise, I believe that, and here the agency has its responsibility and has to provide support, and we have to mobilize other financiers more effectively. I did during the first phase of BioDave. I didn't see enough of this. The priority is given to biodiversity. That is true. This is an association with the World Bank and the European Union. I believe that we need proper financing and here we have to emphasize a political dimension. We have to do this together. I think I've covered what I want to say, but just one other thing I'd like to mention. And I think it's a lot of projects in Mozambique with multi-sector platforms. I think we have to move more in that direction in the framework of BioDev. So I think different projects, many different projects are involved in this approach of dialogue with the private sector. And also, we can be satisfied the second phase as it's starting now. I think during the second phase, well, here we have to prepare the second phase with all players. We have to come to an agreement about the objectives and the follow-up methods during the second phase. And we have to remobilize some players who are less present during the first phase of BioDev. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Emily. The message was clear about the challenges during the second phase, and your recommendations were clear. We clearly heard what you said about co-building objectives. Now we're going to move on to Veronique Andrieux, EGF France Director, Veronique Andrieux, WWF Director, and Nicolas Chenet. Also, Veronique, could you tell us how your activities are part of the activities of involved in actions carried out now with respect to biodiversity? Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for inviting me and for this opportunity to share several messages with you. On behalf of WWF France, this project is a priority for us. It's very important for us. Everything's been said this morning in terms of lessons learned and in terms of the deliverables of this first phase. And we've talked about the second phase, now several key messages now. First message, there's a question related to sectorial policies. We see that problems in these 16 countries reflect problems we find in France. We're in the midst of negotiations about national diversity negotiations in France. We have the same problems in France, typical problems of countries with a lot of biodiversity. And there's a big challenge with respect to the 70%, which is not covered by the Kunming-Montreal. We have this framework with the 2030 agenda. Clearly, the challenge will be for sectorial policies, as we've seen. That it was a big challenge to the process, namely of moving toward a nature-positive economy that is really essential for biodiversity. The advantage of this approach, then, and in this context, is to focus on the 10, 15 targets in the program. Let me develop that. Target number 10, that is sustainable management of economic activities like agricultural, fishing, and forestry, agriculture. That's essential to make sure that these economic activities are positive for biodiversity. We have to make sure that they have to be carried out in a sustainable way. It's 10. It's objective 10 of GBF. And then there's 14, the integration of biodiversity into public sector policies and also into national finances. That's essential. And objective 15, that is about the responsibility of businesses and financial institutions. That's important. So we're talking about risk and impact on biodiversity. This approach, 2 years before the GBF, this approach is already well in line, and it's essential to continue to move in that direction, namely towards systemic transformation. We have to deal with questions of the ecological footprint. Maybe 3 other points. It has been already said in previous presentations, the need to remove obstacles which are in some national policies. Sometimes these national policies are simply not involved. In other cases, they are insufficient. And there is a need to revise the regulatory and fiscal framework in those countries. As we've seen, it might be with respect to mining laws, real estate rules, certification rules, and licenses. And it's essential to revise this legal and administrative framework at the national level in order to remove barriers and obstacles and to create enabling conditions so that biodiversity can progress. Then there's the issue of financing. We've seen at different COPs, and we're going to see it again. That is at the heart of what is being discussed with respect to the reform of the Bretton Woods Institution. Biodiversity is at the center of this. It is absolutely essential to mobilize resources, financial resources, public and private resources, to finance the biodiversity energy. For this, we've seen the example of Tunisia. It was very interesting to see how mobilization of the banking sector at the national level and the logic of mobilizing national resources. Well, we saw how important it is with the Charter of Equivalence. We talked about the role of banks in Tunisia and also including biodiversity criteria in investment decisions and portfolio decisions of banks. And the last point, it's the question of the economic model behind practices in biodiversity. That's essential. Certification is an issue. Sustainable practices must be included in certification. And we talked about obstacles in terms of revenue and competitiveness at local markets. There's a problem. How can I make sure that these practices, these sustainable management practices, can help increase income and offer better access to the market and remain competitive economically? It's absolutely essential to deal with this issue in terms of economic feasibility, competitiveness, and added value. So for me, those were the important issues. We talked about BIODEV. This is an important vehicle for action by France in terms of biodiversity. This has just started with GBF, and right now it's beginning, and with financing based on sectorial policies and sectorial practices. And we're also witnessing pilot actions in the field to carry out these voluntary commitments. In reality, we have to move on to practice, move on to action. The fact that France is involved with action in southern countries in terms of green diplomacy, actions will take place this year. It's very important. And also, we facilitate access to funding and technical assistance so that these countries can fully play a role in terms of biodiversity. That is what I wanted to say. And we think it's very important to see how BioDev will work out in the future in different countries.
And thank you for your testimony. And Nicolas Chenet, now you're the Director of Sustainable Development Department of Expertise France. Can you give us a few words on the specificity of a BioDev project as part of Expertise France and how this type of project and multi-stakeholder dialogue is important to reach the objectives of the global biodiversity framework. Expertise France, we are an agency, implementation agency. We started this project when it started. We were not integrated to BFD when it started. So we are the implementation agency of French Development Agency, and integrating finance is really very, very important. And it was really a key in the negotiations that we had in Montreal. If the alignment of actions and stakeholders, and this project is, of course, the objective is really to ensure that we have objectives that are totally aligned. Nowadays, we have a framework and objectives, and we're happy about this, because we really waited for them for quite a while, because in this project always integrated this COP15, and we waited for this for a long, long, long time. It was pushed back, and we have this message from IPPC. There is an emergency now, and we cannot wait for the objectives to do the implementation. We need to ensure that it's really the mission of this project, that we have actions that are simultaneous, coherent with all the objectives and the framework that we have and that we want. So this program is in essence absolutely urgent and the multidimensional. And we work on several countries, and it's a bit basic, but of course we have capitalization, comments from experiences, and we have lessons to learn. It's very interesting to hear what worked well, what didn't work well, civil society being involved, how we could ensure that governments were listening to us, were with us, with the different organizations in the countries, because the countries are very different. The fact that the private sector is involved, this is issues that we need to capitalize on this. A lot of capitalization work was carried out as part of this project. And of course, there is an aspect, and maybe it's a little bit basics, but of course, economy at scale, when we work on that type of programs, if we have 16 programs of that nature, and it's all the same program, it's going to be far more expensive. It's going to take much more time. We'll put much more energy into it. So it's always good. And for us, as an implementation agency, we need coherency on all those actions. And it's really important to have coherence. And we gain a lot from this. And again, we can't afford to have things that it needs to be simultaneous. It can't go one thing after another. It needs to be simultaneous because of the urgency that we have. I would say as well, but as implementation agency, Expertise France, Gilles mentioned this as well, we have a coherency with the other projects that we're implementing. Biodiversity, of course, is very, very strong. So, of course, second phase of 2020, that was financed by the European Union. And we were lucky to share a pavilion with all the stakeholders at the COP in Montreal. And it was a very good demonstration of the synergy that we have different projects that are being financed, but different financial because it's not always the same. And we have BioDev in front of us and other programs with the European Union. We are talking a lot on subjects with blue economy, with the forest, international negotiations, especially with northern countries. And we talk about the European Union, about negotiation and implementation of the negotiations with the United States as well, Canada, United Kingdom, Japan. So we are very motivated and so that the frame is as large as possible. And the logic for the financial bakers is it's really transversal and integrated to the projects. So the task we have in front of us is huge, but again, it's urgent. There is an emergency there, and we ensure. So it's the end of a project, but of course there'll be a follow-up. So it's not because the projects are less important or less successful that there is a second phase. No, we're very happy to carry out this commitment with our partners and to say thank you. So we say thank you as well to, of course, French Development Agency, the Ministry of French Foreign Affairs that financed this project. And I want to say thank you, Guillaume and Christophe, who are here as well, because we were at the initiative from the start of this project with the French Development Agency. We are a team, and they are the origin of this project. I want to thank as well WWF and also IUCN, because we worked in synergy with them, and also notably in this logic of capitalization, we exchanged a lot of work was being carried out. And I hope that we'll have a phase 2 that will be as inspiring and as efficient as possible. And I hope that we go as far as possible in the implementation again. And I hope that it was not the objective of BioDev. It's not the only objective of BioDev. We are not only in terms of declaration of intentions, we have actions in the sectorial politics and in the implementation. And I want to say thank you to you all for this pilot committee, final pilot committee. But again, it's just one more step because the project is still being built as we speak. Thank you, Nicolas. Last intervention from Chris Buss. He's with us online. And Chris is the director for IUCN Center for Economy and Finance.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Chris, for being with us. I know that you wanted to be with us on site, but yes, you had some difficulty with the train. So you are the last speaker of our event, and we are really pleased to welcome you, even if it's remotely. So, Chris, can you tell us how does the BioDev project fit into the overall strategy of IUCN? And can you tell us a bit more about what you think about this project and what are the main advantages of a multi-stakeholders dialogue project like BioDev when it comes to reaching the Global Biodiversity Framework targets approved in Montreal?
Yes, and thank you. Thanks also very much for the invitation and opportunity to speak on behalf of IUCN. We've heard a lot of, and apologies, I'm not able to be with you today. It was the original plan, but so circumstances change, don't they? But I think just to as a starting point, I think one of the great advantages of being one of the last speakers is you hear everything that's been said before, but it also takes away a lot of the words that you planned before. But I think what we have heard is the country's successes that we've heard. We heard of the voluntary commitments. We've heard of the organizations involved. We've heard of the sectoral transformation, and I think every credit should be given to the partners who've been involved in driving this, and the support that's been given by the French government in financing this. I think in respect to where you mentioned some of the
leverage points for IUCN, and I think what we have heard a lot is how the work of BioDev has been underpinned by process. And we see that in respect to the knowledge and the research that's been done. And we've heard about the publications and the specific detailed analysis in the countries. But we've also heard about the dialogue process that has brought together many organisations. I think I saw 672, which is incredible and so important to make sure that all stakeholders are involved in such a process. And then from the knowledge research, from the dialogue, that's led to the voluntary elements of voluntary commitments, but also to both national and global policy shift. And I think that's been a critical part of the process and has been really outlined today and of what we've seen. And I think for us as a critical point that this is, as I say, on the dialogue process but even the knowledge research and the voluntary commitments and the policy has been underpinned by partnerships. And one of the things that we see critical as IUCN and as do the other partners is our role in the union. And that's bringing along the state governments. And I think we've seen and heard how the state governments have been involved, but also how the non-state governments have also been involved in shifting this. But I think that the exciting part of what we've seen in BioDev has been the shift by the private sector. And the third point, I think that what we've seen in BioDev is that local to global shift. And I mentioned the private sector because all the work that's been done at country level, specific landscapes, specific sectors, specific national policies, has had the integration of the private sector. And I think what the exciting thing for the Global Biodiversity Framework, but not only that, other UN conventions. I've been heavily involved in the UNFCCC processes, but also UNCCD, and the suite of them has been over the last 2 years where we've seen the private sector being more involved in those discussions, in the discussions around the negotiations, and making sure that the shift is including how the private sector work. And I think that's really helping shift private sector change. And I think that in the suite of sectors, I think obviously in the land use, the agricultural sector and the mining sector have been extremely prominent in that. And that's no coincidence that in Sharm el Sheikh, I think that both the agricultural world and then in Montreal, farmers were center to a lot of discussions that were going on, and not just being seen as a threat, but also being seen as a solution. So I think in relation to moving forward and reinforcing the value of where we see this as IUCN is, we've also heard a lot about the application of tools and the application of processes. Antonin referred to the STAR and gave a response. So it's interesting. One of the few questions that have come up were in relation to those metrics and how we use the STAR tool, but also how we're then building our work with Nature Positive and looking at different sectors that have a direct impact on nature, sectors that have an indirect impact on nature, but also finance institutions, and how we're working on and making sure that they have a positive impact on nature and driving the nature positive agenda and the metrics around that builds on the key biodiversity areas, the red list of ecosystems, and the integrated biodiversity assessment tool. So they're critical tools that I think as we move forward into phase 2 as part of the implication. And actually, just in this panel, it's quite interesting that we've heard also a lot around certification. Certification is great; it's a wonderful market verification tool. But we also have to be. I come from the forestry sector, and there's only 10% of forest products so far that are under certification that we need to. So how do we shift that needle and control the markets? There's particularly some of the EU legislation is coming in now and responding to that with the countries, so we're not putting in perverse impacts. And I think that's also, that's also looking at impact, but what is also the opportunity that we have here and looking at the MBS standard that IUCN have developed to make sure we have a quality of implementation of the responses that we're seeing under the voluntary commitments. Just a couple more final points is, I think, just building on the 672 organizations and making sure the actors are all involved. And I think, obviously from an IUCN perspective, is making sure we work with our members. And we've seen that, how I think what BioDev has done so well is mobilized the governments, mobilized the private sector, but not just at local and national level, but also integrated those into some of the discussions of how we've helped influence the global policy, and particularly the Global Biodiversity Framework. But I think it's also critical, and I've enjoyed hearing the phrases around champions and around sectoral shifts. And I think it was Zhao who mentioned go beyond. And for us at IUCN, that's a critically important. This just isn't seen as nice partnerships with the private sector, but it's working with private sector champions who want to go beyond the regulations, who want to go beyond the frameworks, and who want to drive change. And I think that will be critical as we move forward in influencing both national and global policies. And then finally, I just want to touch on the shift in finance and the critical shift in finance that we have, but also looking at phase 2 and how we mobilize that finance. So obviously, sometimes we get caught up in the sort of narrative that we need 300 to 400 billion directed towards nature, protection of nature, restoration of nature, conservation of nature. But one could also argue that there's a lot of that money that's already existing, and it's just how we shift the flow of funds. How do we shift public finance, both at national and global level? How do we shift the subsidies? How do we shift the negative incentives to being nature positive, to making sure that we integrate nature-based solutions? I think will be critical. And how we build up then also more of the multilateral finance, the GCF financing to support countries in this transition, support countries and the private sector and local actors in this shift towards a much more nature positive economy. But also then how do we mobilize private finance? I think that the one that gets a lot of publicity, so to say, is the direct impact investment, and how we're looking at sort of impact funds for nature. But also, I think what I really like about BioDev is we're working with corporate finance, and how do we shift those investments into a nature positive finance? So I think those three, the public finance, the direct impact investment finance, but also importantly, the corporate finance. So we're integrating nature-based solutions into agricultural systems. Why do we need to protect and restore watersheds? Well, it's simple, because it stops flash flooding, and it helps enhance soil productivity, whereby enhances yield. So it's just a basic business sense as well. So we need to make sure we're integrating that. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity for IUCN. We see the opportunity. It's great that there's a second phase where we can work with the partners to making sure that we're bringing together our values on tools and knowledge, and the partnerships to help the program really shift that direction of finance. So thanks very much for the opportunity, and I hand back to the room in Paris.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this final answer.
Our event is going to end. We are a little bit late, so we're going to stop here today. Thank you very much, especially for people who are following us on video conference, because you stayed with us till the very end. So you can follow us on social media. Because there will be a phase 2 of BioDev, internet site and the different social media. And for those who are still with us here in this room, so we have a buffet after this event for those who are presently here with us. Thank you to you all again, and have a very good day.